Good evening, everybody. I wanted to take a few moments today to talk about a new type of ransomware that's being seen and becoming quite popular. Essentially, rather than delivering ransomware directly to the computer, the attackers are delivering a virtual machine, normally in the instance of VirtualBox, to the computer. And when the user gets that payload, whether they download that payload using a macro in an Office document or whether they manually download it from the internet and double click on it, that payload essentially launches up a virtual machine in the background. This virtual machine is now running on your network. It's now running in your environment. It's behind your firewall, and it is typically running some kind of remote access tools like GoToAssist or Screen Connect that allows an attacker to connect onto the virtual machine and use the fact they're inside your perimeter to encrypt or steal your data. I wanted to talk about a few different things you can do to help protect yourself from this, and security is always in layers. So I'm going to talk with the most obvious one first. If you are using ThreatLocker and you don't have VirtualBox in your environment, you probably don't have a policy created for VirtualBox, but go into your policies and make sure you don't have one from historic reasons enabled, because if VirtualBox cannot run, it's not going to be able to be used in this attack instance. Just to do that, you can go into your policies here, check the different groups, and just make sure there's no VirtualBox policy in here. If there is, just change that policy to deny or delete it. If you don't have a VirtualBox policy, an attacker isn't going to be able to deliver that VirtualBox payload. When they do try, and it's going to get blocked by the application whitelisting, because ultimately, if it can't run, then it can't do any damage. The other area I wanted to talk about, while this attack appears to only be limited to VirtualBox at this point in time, essentially there's no reason that an attacker couldn't use a similar or create a similar attack using Hyper-V or VMware. Again, if you don't run VMware in your environment, don't allow it to run. If you do run it and only run it on a few different machines, only allow it to run on those few machines. So just maybe check your policies, make sure you don't have a VMware policy where not required, make sure you don't have a VirtualBox policy. Now, talking about Hyper-V, that one's a little bit more tricky because Hyper-V is essentially part of the Windows core operating system, which means you probably have a policy to allow the Windows core files. So if you don't use Hyper-V, or you only use Hyper-V in limited machines, maybe go into the ThreatLocker portal and add our suggested policies to block Hyper-V for the groups you don't use it. You can just come into here, click Add Suggested Policies. When you add that, this is essentially going to block Hyper-V from running on that group of computers or in that environment for you. If you do need Hyper-V, the next thing you want to do is make sure, or an additional thing you may want to do anyway, is to make sure that people can't automatically create and spin up Hyper-V images. The way that's likely to happen is most likely through PowerShell. So there's a couple of policies you want to make sure you've got in place. And these are policies you probably should have in place anyway. One of which is making sure Microsoft Office, Google Chrome, Internet Explorer are all ring-fenced, so they can't call PowerShell. So if somebody sends you a Word document with a macro in it and it tries to call PowerShell or command prompt, download a virtual machine, and then execute that virtual machine, it's not going to be able to do that. So make sure you have that policy in place. You can see it here. I'll show you. This is the Office policy here. It essentially says Microsoft Office is allowed to run, but it's not allowed to call PowerShell, it's not allowed to call C-Script or the scripting languages. This is going to stop any automation of virtual machines being created from an Office document or from a web browser or Internet Explorer or any kind of Zoom or front-end application. The other thing you can do is make sure you have the PowerShell ring fencing policy in place. This is created by default on all deployments in the last few months, and it's there as a suggested policy if it wasn't created by default. This policy essentially stops Internet Explorer being able to go out to the internet, PowerShell from being able to go out to the internet or from accessing your files. If you stop PowerShell going out to the internet, it can't be used to download that virtual machine in the first place. So there are a couple of tips you can use if you are using ThreatLocker. If you're not using ThreatLocker, and really not bad tips as well, there's a couple of things you can do to harden yourself from these type of threats. First of all is, by running a virtual machine in your environment, the attacker hasn't automatically got access to your data. They're essentially inside your firewall, and they're going to be able to use various different tools to get access to your data, and they're certainly one step closer to being able to breach you or cause massive damage. The first way they're going to breach you is using unpatched servers. So if you don't have all of your servers patched and up to date, make sure they are, because once somebody gets on your network, if you have an unpatched domain controller, if you have an unpatched server, the attacker can use something like Eternal Blue or any kind of vulnerability to create a domain admin account on your domain. Once they do that, they can log onto all your servers, they can push out ransomware, they can do pretty much whatever they want. So if you haven't patched your servers, now is a good time to check, go off and make sure they're all patched and up to date. Second thing is, once an attacker's on your network and they've got a machine running, they can run various brute force attacks to try and get your domain admin passwords. Make sure you have secure domain admin passwords, and make sure those passwords those accounts have automatic lockout policies. So if somebody is trying to attack you and they are hitting your domain controller with random passwords, make sure that those accounts have automatic lockout policies after 5+ invalid login attempts. The next thing you want to do is also make sure you have lock policies. So if they do get onto a machine and it's locked, they have to unlock it to go one step further. Make sure you have dual factor authentication on your servers. Very, very useful. If you're using ThreatLocker version 5.25 or above, we have a feature for remote presence for our storage control. What this means is you can set a storage policy to say, do not allow machines not running the ThreatLocker service to access these file shares. So if they do manage to get your password, if they do manage to get access to your file share, they won't be able to access that file share using their rogue, their hostage taking machine, if you like. General cybersecurity hygiene is always going to help you when somebody gets into your network. So one other thing I would suggest is making sure you have personal firewalls on all devices that can have personal firewalls on. So if you have laptops or desktops, enable the Windows firewall. That means if somebody does get on your network, essentially they're not going to be able to send payloads to your desktops or laptops or even servers if you can enable those firewalls. In most cases, there's no reason to not enable the Windows firewalls on your Hyper-V, your VMware, or your physical servers. Domain controllers are a little bit more tricky because you have to open certain ports, but certainly on those physical boxes, those backup servers, you can really harden them by enabling the firewall. Thank you for listening. Have a great Memorial Day and safe weekend. Thank you.